Good day. Today is Saturday, 11th January 2025, and before I start dealing with the more substantive topics in this program, there's a few things I want to say about some of the subjects that have been dominating the news media. The first is I need to say something about the fires in Los Angeles. This is turning rapidly into an absolutely epic disaster. It seems thousands of people have been forced from their homes. Levels of property damage apparently have been extraordinary. And to add to my own personal sense of this tragedy, I should say that two of my dearest friends, long-standing friends, are caught up in it. They live in this area of Los Angeles. A couple of days ago, we were in contact with them. They told us some days ago that they were being evacuated from their home, and to our growing concern, we have not heard from them since. So this is a terrible tragedy. Now, there's been a huge amount of discussion in the media space as to how this has happened, whether there's been problems with firefighters, whether the equipment that was needed to deal with these fires had perhaps previously been sent elsewhere, maybe even to Ukraine. About this I know nothing. There have been inevitable comparisons made between the funding the United States government provides other foreign governments with the neglect or alleged neglect of cities like Los Angeles. I don't really feel competent to discuss these matters from London. All I would say is that clearly this is an appalling event, and I'm very concerned for my friends and, of course, for everybody else caught up in this. I assume that there will be some kind of investigation after the events have run their course, and we will get some of the answers. I'm far from confident, by the way, that will happen, not given the realities of the current world. But anyway, there it is. I hope that there is such an investigation, but my concern at the moment is for the people who are caught up in the tragedy, amongst whom, as I said, are two of my very dearest friends. Now, there's been other things that have happened. Many of you, no doubt, especially those of you in Britain, are aware of the fact that there has been a conflict raging between the British government and Elon Musk over the handling of certain very serious criminal cases involving gangs. I'm being extraordinarily careful now what I say. Bear in mind that I live in London. Anyway, there's been a major dispute and argument about this. There's been a demand in London from supporters of the government that we take sides and that we oppose what Elon Musk is supposedly trying to do, which is alleged to be engineering the fall of the British Prime Minister. A lot of rhetoric of this kind, all of which it seems to me takes away the attention, the focus from the real problem, which is the original problem of the gangs. Now, in relation to what should be done about this, well, there have been some criminal cases. There have been various inquiries. I would simply say this: in his own political interest, the Prime Minister ought to be doing that which the Labour Council in Oldham asked him to do, which is to appoint a full public inquiry to examine and review what has happened. This does not mean, by the way, holding back on doing things that other inquiries have proposed, nor is it a reason to delay prosecutions. if those are called for, but there clearly have been major problems within the system, and there seems to me to be, anyway, a good objective case for holding such an inquiry. I am frankly baffled as to why the Prime Minister and his officials are digging in their heels about this. They say that all of the main questions have already been answered. I beg to disagree. But even if that were true, it does seem to me that simply as an act of political sense, it would make sense for the Prime Minister to order an inquiry so that all of the various things that people are saying, the speculations that are being spread, that they can be addressed and, if need be, refuted. In some cases, I wonder whether the concern rather is that some of those speculations may be confirmed. But anyway, one way or the other, simply on political grounds, an investigation, a public inquiry rather, should certainly be launched. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, apparently supports the idea, and I don't myself see any reason at all why an inquiry of that kind ought not to be set up. And by the way, I expect that eventually, at some point, one will be. So it might be just as well to agree to it now, rather than put oneself in an even more politically embarrassing position when, if you are in government, you find yourself obliged to agree to something that you've previously rejected later. Anyway, that's my thoughts on this. And the third is about a certain case that's taking place in New York, in which the defendant is none other than the president-elect. I've already made known my complete disbelief in the case. We've done programs about it, extensive programs about it on the Duran. We've analysed it with American lawyers. If you want my own personal views about this, if you want to see where it's all written out, I would suggest go to Jonathan Turley's blog, Res Ipsa Loquitur. He sets out in great detail his thoughts about the eccentric nature of the court case. Again, I am choosing my words extremely carefully, and the fact that the eventual decision made, frankly, no sense at all. Now, as to the decision to give the defendant an unconditional discharge, the judge has come up with all kinds of rather complex explanations, which I don't fully understand. He says that the president-elect, for the moment, remains a private individual, and that this is a case which is not covered by the recent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity in certain cases. In which case, I'm not sure why, since the judge decided to move forward with sentencing, he chose to go with an unconditional discharge. It seems to me that contradicts his own reasoning. Just saying. But in any event, I've never taken this case seriously in objective terms. My own guess is that there's going to be a sequence of appeals. I expect that those appeals will eventually find their way to the Supreme Court of the United States. I think the recent decision of the Supreme Court of the United States not to prevent the sentencing hearing that has just taken place is completely understandable on strict legal terms. That doesn't mean that I think it was the most appropriate decision to make, but I do understand why the Supreme Court might have made it. I suspect that the case will eventually go to the Supreme Court, and given the fact that the Supreme Court only refused to interfere with the sentencing hearing by a 5-4 majority, I expect that ultimately this entire case will eventually be set aside on appeal, either within the New York judiciary or perhaps at the level of the Supreme Court of the United States. In my opinion, that was the last gasp of a complex succession of legal cases that have been brought against the president-elect, basically to discredit him and to make his political position impossible, which backfired disastrously, politically, and perhaps even electorally, on those who brought them. Anyway, that's my view about these three issues. Of these three issues, let me say that the first two, as far as I'm concerned, are very serious matters indeed. The third, the one about the court case, well, it affects the president-elect and his family. But in my opinion, it's basically the very last paragraph in a long book that has now been written and is about to be thrown away. Let me now turn to the more substantive topics that I want to discuss on this program. And these, the one that I want to discuss first is the one that I think in some respects is the most consequential, which is the announcement by the Biden administration of its oil sanctions, its sanctions against the Russian oil industry. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we got the first article in Bloomberg saying that the Biden administration was considering imposing further sanctions about the Russian oil industry. At that time, I said, and we discussed on the Duran, and we said that article was actually misleading when it said that there were discussions about imposing sanctions, further sanctions on the Russian oil industry, and that no final decisions had been made. That was already untrue. Articles of that kind only appear when the decision to impose the sanctions has already been made. We've seen this pattern with this administration many, many times now. The one that I feel the most angry about is the one concerning the launching of the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles into pre-2014 Russian territory. We were told for many months, right through the summer, that this was up for debate. And then the New York Times squirreled into a long article an admission that the decision to do it had actually been made back in the spring. So that by the time the decision was put into effect in November, it was simply putting into effect a decision which actually had already, months before, been already taken. Well, the same applies to the oil sanctions. When articles appear in Bloomberg telling us that the Biden administration is considering doing something of this kind, and that no final decision has been made, you can be confident that the discussions, such as they were, are already over, and the decision has actually been made. And then about 10 days ago, I seem to remember it was, a follow-up article appeared in the Washington Post, essentially telling us the same thing as the Bloomberg article, again repeating the frankly misleading claim that there'd be no final decision made yet, when there clearly had been, and again preparing us for the fact that the decision to impose these sanctions had already been made. So what about the sanctions? As I said, they have now, the announcement has been made. We now do actually have the sanctions. The sanctions are already in place. And, well, what perhaps are the sanctions and how are the Russians responding? Well, the first thing to say about the sanctions is that they are indeed comprehensive. I mean, they do cover various institutions within the Russian energy industry, Gazprom, the insurance companies within Russia, the big state insurance company within Russia. Rosneft executives apparently are being sanctioned. So apparently are other executives as well, including, rather strangely, sanctions against the management of Rosatom, the nuclear energy provider, one of the major technology companies in Russia, which has actually no connection, as far as I'm aware, with the oil industry at all. Just saying. And alongside these sanctions, lots of individuals have also been sanctioned. Well, we've seen that happen many times. These sanctions against these individuals are of little consequence, I suspect, to most of these individuals in the event that they have property in the West. That property will be frozen or seized. But I'm going to make a guess that if any one of these individuals had any property in the West, they will have disposed of it long ago, because all of them would have known that sooner or later they would find themselves on a sanctions list, given that they are operating within the industry, an industry which the United States was known to be targeting. Perhaps the most serious point about these sanctions, the most serious part of the sanctions, is that it targets the various oil tankers and ships, 185 of them altogether. I'm not saying that's the complete number, but 185 ships that carry Russian oil. They've all been sanctioned, which will make it more difficult for these tankers to obtain insurance. But of course, since the ships are now sanctioned, what other things can they be used for? What other business can they perform now globally other than to transport Russian oil? Again, I wonder whether this fact is one that the people who have framed these sanctions fully understand. Some of these are old ships, and they will no doubt have difficulties getting repairs done and finding crews, but you can always find crews. If you know anything about shipping, you know what a complex and interesting business the business of finding crews is, and that you actually find many of the crews for merchant ships in all sorts of places around the world, not necessarily the famous places like the Netherlands, for example, but all kinds of places in East Asia and wherever. You'll always find crews. You'll always find captains who will manage these ships. There are plenty of Russian captains who could manage these ships. Just saying. And of course, if the ships need insurance, well, they can get it. They can get it from the same Russian insurance companies that have been insuring them already, and which are themselves sanctioned, and which therefore have no need to worry about the fact that they are sanctioning already sanctioned Russian ships. Just saying. And these tankers, as I said, will have problems docking into some ports, perhaps, but not into all ports. Ports in India and other places will probably still want to receive them, and there's all kinds of ways in which ships can move through the seas. And as for getting repairs, well, they can get repairs in all sorts of places. A lot of this can be done under the radar. And of course, there's always the option, again, of getting the repairs done in Russian dockyards. But I'm sure it can be done in the dockyards of many other countries around the world. The international shipping industry is extremely complicated. It is quite likely that the owners of these ships, some of them at least, will now want to dispose of them. So these ships will be bought on the international shipping market. They'll become available to buy on the international shipping market. And given that they are now operating as part of the Russian oil industry, it's plausible that the buyers who will buy them, and there are always buyers, are going to be people who are interested in supplying Russian oil. So it's not going to have the effect that some people in Washington perhaps imagine. I've discussed this many times. I remember having this whole discussion about the Czech plan to buy weapons on the international arms market. I said at the time when that plan was first floated that it would prove to be a complete debacle. That the kind of weapons that would be sold to the Czechs with the unlimited funding that the Czechs were being given by the European Union would be ludicrously overpriced and in some cases defective and provided in far smaller quantities than the Czechs and the Europeans who were funding the program imagined. And I said that the people who were doing this just didn't understand at all, quite obviously, the way in which the international arms business works, at least at that kind of level, in trading in second-hand arms. And I'm going to say the same is about shipping. I don't think the people who have come up with these sanctions truly understand how shipping works. It's an enormous industry. It is very, very complicated. Many of the people who operate it are incredibly resourceful and extremely tough. There are many, many players, there are many, many ships. There's crews that can be accessed from all sorts of places. Once upon a time, long ago, in the 60s, before, it was all centred on London. But the days when that was true have long since passed. And as I said, what these sanctions are going to do is that they're going to create some logistic difficulties with the ships. But ultimately, it's not going to be a huge problem. The Russians, or it may not be the Russians, it might be others who are interested in working within this industry, which is clearly a very lucrative industry, are going to buy up all of these ships. Other ships will replace them. There'll be all kinds of things done in all sorts of places. But the fact is that so long as there is a demand for Russian oil products, and so long as there is a supply of Russian oil products, these products will always get from A to B, from the supplier to the customer. All that these sanctions do is that they complicate the process of supply and they increase the number of middlemen, many of whom are pretty tough but also rather shady individuals, just saying. It's going to increase the number of middlemen and make the entire industry even more opaque than it already is, which will of course mean that it'll be even more difficult to keep track of it. And of course, the Biden people are tacking onto the sanctions some kind of provision, which apparently only comes into force in February, so it really will depend on Donald Trump whether it's enforced at all, Donald Trump and his people, whether it's enforced at all, which is that the United States reserves the right to impose sanctions on anybody who is involved in any way in working with the Russian oil trade. Except, of course, that they've already possessed that power already, so that this provision actually, in substantive terms, adds nothing. It's just a threat which all of those people who've been working in this trade have always known about, and they've been prepared to work in this industry despite the fact that they've always known about this threat. And of course, the fact that this threat is being made by an administration which is literally now in its last 10 days is going to mean that many people are going to feel that this threat is essentially empty. There's inevitably going to be doubts and skepticism about whether or not the Trump administration is really going to enforce these sanctions in any serious way. Now, the Russians are predictably saying that this is not going to affect their exports. And there's a report about this in TASS, market not believing in significant dip of Russian oil exports. And the person who TASS has consulted is Alexei Belogoriev, who is the research director of the Institute of Energy and Finance in Moscow. And this is what the report says. The extent of sanctions' effect on exports will become fully clear in several weeks at the earliest. The Brent price hike to $80 per barrel reflects this uncertainty. The market stops at the upper limit of the price corridor established during the last 6 years, but the share of Russian premium in this growth is still small, in my opinion. If the players are indeed concerned of a significant dip in Russian oil exports, the appreciation of prices would have been much more abrupt. That is what Belogoriev says. And elsewhere, TASS reports him as saying that market players believe that sanctions imposed by the US on the Russian oil and gas sector will not result in a significant decline in the country's oil exports, but will increase logistical costs and discounts. And Belogoriev then goes on to say the most serious part of the sanctions package is related to tankers, and US sanctions can indeed disrupt the logistics of Russian supplies for some time. As a minimum, they will lead to the notable growth of transportation costs and hence to the increase of discounts for Russian oil, the spread in prices of Russian shipping in Russian ports, and unloading in ports of consignees. So the oil will continue to be transported, but there will be costs. There will be costs involved. But of course, the costs are going to eventually be passed on to the end users, because that is the way the oil industry works. Every single payment made to a middleman, every cutback in every discount the Russians give in the price of their oil to some of these middlemen, that inevitably is going to complicate the industry more, and that complication is going to result in higher prices for the eventual consumer. To the extent that, of course, this sanctions package can, in the first few weeks and months, lead to a reduction in exports of Russian oil, that will reduce the amount of oil on the international markets, and that too will lead to a growth in prices. But eventually, as we have repeatedly seen, the market stabilizes, the Russians themselves work out workarounds. The market assists them to find workarounds, and the problem is reduced. As for the Russians, if they are having to pay more to get their oil onto the market, and if they are receiving less for their oil, well, they have a simple solution, which is that they let the ruble depreciate a little, and the difference, and that makes up the difference in terms of the ruble price. They simply let the ruble fall a little, compensating for any fall in receipts, and the budget is protected. It's what the Russians have repeatedly done. It is why some people in the West refer to the volatility of the ruble, the way the Russians operate the ruble, as a dirty float. It's far from declines in the ruble being a sign, in the exchange rate of the ruble, being a sign of economic weakness. They're simply a mechanism that the Russians themselves use in order to keep their own exports, their own export trade, competitive. So, there might be disruptions, in fact, there will be supply disruptions over the next few weeks and months. My guess is it will take about 3 to 6 months, assuming that the sanctions remain in place, for this thing to work its way through, for the workarounds to be fully sorted out and established, and then we'll be back to normal, except that there will be another structural problem within the energy markets, which will mean that the price of oil is going to be higher than it might otherwise have been. And the most extraordinary thing is that Biden himself has acknowledged this. He's actually said that it's, and I'm quoting him directly, apparently this was said over the course of a press conference discussing the fires in Los Angeles, but he actually said it is probable that gas prices, he means of course gas prices at the petrol stations in the United States, could increase as much as 3 to 4% per gallon. When he was asked this question, he said that this is going to hurt the Russians more than it's going to hurt American consumers, and that the situation in the energy markets is much better than it was back in 2022. Well, it may be better than it was after the original sanctions were imposed in 2022. But in actual fact, we are looking at rising energy costs in Europe, and in Britain today, British Gas, one of the major energy suppliers, is giving out warnings that there is a general shortage of natural gas available within Britain, and that might actually lead to blackouts. So there's been problems with the energy system. Of course, people will say, and they will correctly say, that gas is not the same as oil. We're looking at different trades, all of that. But ultimately, when all is said and done, I don't really think that it is a single energy market. Energy prices in one sector are inevitably going to affect energy prices in a different sector. If people, for example, have to turn and use more oil to make up for higher prices in gas, that's inevitably going to put upward pressure on oil prices. Just saying. Anyway, that's Biden. It's going to lead to more prices. It's not going to have the massive impact on the Russian economy that many people assume it will. Now, Ian Proud, the former British diplomat who has actually involved heavily in sanctions administration whilst he was a diplomat, a British diplomat in Moscow. And he writes extremely informative articles on his blog, which has now moved, by the way, to Substack, and also on responsible statecraft. Anyway, he has made some rather interesting points about the Russian economy. He has pointed out that yes, Russia is going through a period of inflation. Yes, interest rates are high, though for the moment, those high interest rates are not affecting the underlying economy anywhere near to as much as I think some people in the West might expect. And the reason for this, again, we come back to that very low level of indebtedness that exists in Russia. He pointed out that debt to GDP ratio in Russia, state debt to GDP ratio in Russia is only 14%. It's actually been falling, I think, in the last few years. The Russian government has an enormous amount of fiscal space if it wants to use it. And debt levels in Russia altogether continue to be significantly lower than they are in the West. So all of this means that you have a much more solidly financially based economy than a financial economy within Russia than people realize. The Russian economy can absorb these blows. It is big enough. It is well enough run. It is structurally adapted to absorb sanctions pressure of this kind. As has been pointed out to me many times by many people, sanctioning a country that is self-sufficient in energy, food, and other resources is not an effective strategy in the long term, especially when those resources are needed by the global economy arguably as much as they are by the economy that is being sanctioned. So anyway, there it is. That's where we are with this policy, this decision. Now, a number of things. Why has it been done at this time? Well, the Biden administration, of course, in the run-up to the election, resisted all attempts to impose sanctions, opposed all attempts to impose sanctions on the Russian oil trade, precisely because he did not want to increase prices. Janet Yellen came up with the project of trying to limit the price of Russian oil. She organized through the G7 a price cap of $60 a barrel for Russian oil. That was never adhered to. But at that time, she wasn't prepared. The US administration wasn't prepared to go beyond that. When the Ukrainians started to send their drones to attack Russian oil refineries and Russian oil facilities, the Biden administration publicly claimed that it opposed those steps because it was worried that it would have an effect on the world oil price. These pinprick attacks never had any such effect. Just saying, they didn't affect prices inside Russia. They didn't affect global energy prices at all. But anyway, the Biden administration was signaling through its opposition, through its declared opposition to those Ukrainian attacks, the fact that it did not want to see disruptions in Russia's oil trade because it was important to keep oil prices low. That was before the election. Now the election is out of the way. Donald Trump has won. In 10 days' time, he is going to become president of the United States. And Joe Biden has signed off on a decision which, by his own admission, is going to add 3 to 4 cents to the price of a gallon of gas, of oil, I should say, petrol, in the United States. In other words, he's just signed off on an inflationary move. And this at a time when there are growing concerns that inflationary pressures in the United States are increasing again, and that the Federal Reserve Board might no longer have monetary space to continue cutting interest rates. The Biden administration, in other words, wanted to take no step that would raise energy costs and inflation, whilst it was concerned about its prospects in the presidential election in November. But now that Donald Trump won those elections in November, it has happily moved forward with a project to raise energy costs and inflation. I said over previous steps that the Biden administration has taken, that the target of some of these steps has, as much as the Russians, been Donald Trump. In this case, I think this is even clearer. The Russians will be affected to some degree, probably significantly less than Biden and Yellen and Sullivan and Blinken and all of those people imagine. But in the meantime, this is creating more inflationary pressure, more problems with prices that Americans have to pay. Donald Trump knows perfectly well that it was one of the reasons why he won re-election is because Americans were worried about the rise in prices. Joe Biden and his team have now just signed off something that will mean that Donald Trump, their rival, is going to be faced with more issues, more problems that are going to create prices to rise even more. One might be tempted to say that these sanctions target Donald Trump even more than they target Russia. Well, who knows? Now that throws the whole issue back on Donald Trump. Now there is a narrative, there are claims, I believe they're coming from the White House itself, that these sanctions cannot be revoked by Donald Trump. He can't set them aside unless he obtains approval from Congress. I am not sure that this is the case. As I understand it, these sanctions have been imposed through executive orders. Another executive order issued by Biden imposing these sanctions. Executive order, no doubt, drafted by Janet Yellen and the people at the Treasury. I can see no reason why Donald Trump cannot simply rescind an executive order published by his predecessor. Now, Congress does have a mechanism of countering such a step. I believe the technical name is a motion of disapproval. This has to be voted by both houses of Congress, saying that it disapproves of whatever step the president has taken. But the Supreme Court of the United States, as I understand, and I am not an expert in this area, the Supreme Court of the United States has indicated that a motion of disapproval voted by Congress only has legal force if the President of the United States himself accepts it and signs it. So if he refuses his signature, it has no effect. Now, Congress can then override the president's decision, just as it can override the president's vetoes. But that would require a vote by a 2/3 majority in both houses, both the House and the Senate. And the Republicans, of course, have majorities in both. Now, I'm going to be straightforward. If this is correct, then I think that if Donald Trump were to make the decision on the first day that he became president, that this package of measures is inflationary, that it is going to cost American families money and further depress their living standards, and if he was to make a decision to rescind this order, then he could do so. I think it is unlikely that both houses of Congress would vote to pass a motion of disapproval. Perhaps they would. But if Trump then refused to sign the motion, then I think it is absolutely inconceivable that there would be a 2/3 majority in either house to set aside, to reverse his decision. So I think that he's in a position to do this. We're not in the same situation as we were in 2017 after Donald Trump was first elected. At that time, Congress was passing all sorts of laws, which from Trump's point of view, he was very unhappy about. There was the Combating American Enemies Act, or whatever it's called, which he clearly considered unconstitutional. But at that time, he was under investigation as part of the various Russiagate probes. There was a massive narrative being promoted in the media that he had won the election, the 2016 election, after engaging in collusion with the Russians. There was widespread belief in these extraordinary theories, including amongst many people within the Republican Party in Congress. And the Republican Party in Congress at that time was largely controlled by the president's political enemies. So he didn't have the strong political position that he does this time. He didn't have in 2017 the political strength that comes from winning an uncontested election with a majority of the popular vote and with no real claim, no real assertion that he's achieved that victory through any illegal or inappropriate means. So back in 2017, had Trump, for example, refused to sign the Combating America's Adversaries Act, or whatever it was called, he not only probably would have found his decision overridden through votes by Congress, but in my opinion, and I said so at the time, he would have faced a real threat of impeachment proceedings being brought against him in Congress in a way that might have actually succeeded. So he didn't do that. Today, none of this is going to happen. If he simply says he's going to scrap these sanctions, he's going to reverse the executive orders, I can't myself see that Congress can reverse what he has done. And I can't myself see either how Congress would take serious steps to impeach him if he took that line. Now, that does not mean that this is what Donald Trump is going to do. As I said, this is an inflationary move. It is partly targeted against him. It makes his position more difficult. He's now going to become president, telling the American people that he wants to improve their living standards and refuse the pressure upon them from rising prices. And something has just happened which he's not responsible for, but which is likely to make those prices rise. So he might want to do that, but he might nonetheless feel that he has to hold back, despite the fact, as I said, that I don't think there's any serious danger to his political position from Congress if he simply rescinds this latest order that the Biden administration has made on these oil sanctions against Russia. The problem Trump has, however, is that his administration is not yet fully formed. He's proposed various candidates for senior positions to the administration. He wants to make Tulsi Gabbard Director of National Intelligence. He wants to make Pete Hegseth Defense Secretary. There's other controversial appointments that he wants to make as well. And he still has to face the fact that though his supporters control the Republican Party in the House, where the Republicans have a small majority, the Republican Party in the Senate is still largely controlled by old-style Republicans who are hostile to him. His attempts, for example, to get the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, to support his choice for Senate Majority Leader were unsuccessful. The person who won through was a close associate of Trump's nemesis, who is, of course, Mitch McConnell. So Trump has to get his appointments through the Senate. The Democrats almost certainly are going to oppose all of them. He needs the Republicans, the Republican Party in the Senate, therefore, to be united in backing them. And there's no guarantee that they will be. And McConnell, and I suspect that in the Senate he is still Trump's major enemy, has apparently exercised the power to block steps that Trump wants to make very effectively in the past. So, for example, there are rumors, and they are only rumors, that at the end of his presidency, his previous presidency, back in 2021, Donald Trump was considering granting pardons to Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, but was warned off doing so by Mitch McConnell, who supposedly, this is never fully confirmed, supposedly warned him that if he did that, then some Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, would vote in the impeachment proceedings that the Democrats were already bringing, that those Republicans would vote in support of impeachment. Now, if that is true, and again, this has never been, as far as I know, fully confirmed. Well, if that is so, then it shows that McConnell not only has power in the Senate, but is prepared to exercise it. So Trump has to get his people, his nominees through Congress, through the Senate. And probably the first couple of weeks of his presidency, he's going to have to spend an enormous amount of time and draw a lot on his political capital to get that done. Now, possibly rescinding this executive order, which is going to add to the economic burden of American households. Perhaps that would not make this process more difficult than it already is. But I'm not sure. McConnell has repeatedly spoken about his intense support for Ukraine. He's made speeches in recent weeks in which he's basically restated his support for the entire neocon position, not just on Ukraine, but on foreign policy altogether. Ukraine is something he cares about. I can easily see how Ukraine is an issue that he might be able to rally his supporters in the Senate over. He could say that rescinding these latest sanctions, whatever it does for American families, undermines Ukraine and therefore should be opposed. And if that happens, then if Trump does reverse these sanctions, then McConnell might come back and start making trouble in the nomination process, in the confirmation process for Trump's nominees. I am not an expert in the very complex, elaborate, I would even say Byzantine politics of the US Congress, but I can very easily see how that might happen. And Trump might decide that he doesn't need to make his life even more difficult than it's probably going to be anyway when dealing with someone like McConnell, by giving McConnell issues that he can rally some Republicans in the Senate over, and that it might be in his interests, therefore, at least for the time being, to leave the question of these sanctions alone. Just saying. Anyway, the point is that here again, we've seen the Biden administration behave as it has done. It has once more stung like a dead wasp, as we used to say in Greece when I was a child. It's in the last 10 days of its existence. It's imposed these huge oil sanctions on the Russians, ineffective though they are likely to be. If Trump wanted to impose sanctions of this kind on the Russians, well, he's about to become president in 10 days' time. Again, it is completely illogical to the point of being bizarre for the President of the United States, the current President of the United States, in the last 10 days that he is in office, to take a step of this kind, when it is a step that properly should be taken by his successor. After all, it is Trump, not Biden, that is going to have to make all the key decisions from this point going forward. It is Trump who has to deal with the Russians, and to deal with the Ukrainians, and to deal with the Europeans, and to deal with the many other players in this conflict. So it seems to me wholly wrong, an abuse of the presidential prerogatives during the transition period, for the president in the last 10 days of his office to meddle in what Trump is going to do in the way that Biden has just done. Now, having said that, as I said, I've said it may be that for the first couple of weeks, until the confirmation process is basically resolved, Trump will just let this thing ride. He can, when the process is over, in my opinion, still simply rescind these sanctions. Maybe after he's met Putin, once Putin agrees to move forward with negotiations, Trump can at that point say, well, we've got the negotiation process going. The sanctions serve no further purpose. They're a burden on American families. Let's just cancel them. And as I said, I don't myself think that he's going to have any serious problems with Congress if he does that. So, there we are. Another case of the Biden administration, of the old man in the old Oval Office causing trouble for Donald Trump, causing trouble, by the way, for American families, and, by the way, causing trouble for American allies. Now, one country that is going to be affected by this, for example, is going to be India. India imports a lot of Russian oil. Now, they're going to have to pay more for that oil, or the trade in that oil is going to be more complicated than it already is. This at a time when the Indian economy is already suffering from inflation issues, and when the growth rates in India have been falling, with the growth rate for 2024 being apparently disappointing. So I cannot imagine that the Modi government is going to be pleased with this. They will continue to import Russian oil because it makes absolute sense for them to do so. But they're not going to welcome the fact that this whole thing has been done in the way that it has. And of course, the Indians are not going to be the only people who are annoyed by the way in which the Biden administration has acted. We saw how a few weeks ago, when the Biden administration imposed the sanctions on Gazprom Bank, the bank that Europeans use to pay for imports of Russian LNG, how the Biden administration was eventually forced to walk back those sanctions to some extent, following criticism from Turkey and other European states, including, by the way, Hungary. So allies around the world are going to be annoyed. And of course, this event is further proof to many people, in India, in China, in all sorts of places, that, well, relying on a system that depends on the dollar is a mistake. It simply exposes us to sanctions of this kind. We need to press forward, therefore, with setting up an alternative payment and insurance and trading infrastructure, which is, of course, exactly what the BRICS states are doing, what the Kazan summit was all about. And we've just seen that a big player in world trade, and by the way, the oil trade, which is Indonesia, has also just joined the BRICS group. So, from every conceivable point of view, in terms of slowing down the process of slowing down the BRICS process of setting up these alternative trading systems, of preserving dollar hegemony, of doing all of these things, it's a major mistake what the Biden administration has done. But the old man and the people around him couldn't resist doing it. It hurts Donald Trump. It hurts Vladimir Putin. So, since Biden has already failed to gain re-election, why not do it? Even if it costs Americans more, and if it hastens the day when the world exits the dollar. Now, I say that there's been an interesting article in the Financial Times, which looks at the fact that the United States continues to exercise global financial dominance, even as China dominates the world, the world trade in durable goods, in actual hard goods. But squirreled into that article was a really rather interesting admission that the dominance, the financial dominance, is not perhaps quite as stable as is often assumed. And it contains this paragraph. The GCAP, that appears to be a think tank, calculates that between 2015 and 2022, the share of Russian financial services imports controlled by the United States and allies fell from 94% to 84%, which meant that the American coalition's financial power over Russia was approximately halved, contributing to the muted effect of the imposed financial sanctions. That reveals a key point. With hegemonic power, small declines can have outsized effects, or as the GCAP says, moving the share from 95% to 85% can dissipate a lot of power, sometimes as much as moving from 85 to 50%. So even if the dollar continues to be the most heavily used currency, which it almost certainly will for the foreseeable future, if its share and the share of other financial imports or exports around the world, trade around the world, controlled by the United States and its allies, declines, even by a relatively small percentage between 2015 and 2022, in Russia, the decline was just 10%. That can result in a significant fall. It dissipate a lot of power. And of course, Biden has just done something which incentivizes people around the world to do precisely that. Now, the article, by the way, the title of the article, which is by Gillian Tett in the Financial Times, Dollar Dominance Means Tariffs Are Not the Only Game in Town. I think the most important and interesting disclosure was in the paragraphs that I've just read. Well, there we are. That is what the Biden administration has done. It's not going to, as I said, massively impact Russia's oil trade. It's not going to tip the Russian economy into crisis. It's going to increase the price of oil. Not necessarily absolutely, but leave the price of oil higher than it would otherwise be if these sanctions were not in place. It is going to increase the temptation for more and more countries to gradually reduce their dependence on Western financial institutions and on the dollar, which, as we've just been told, can cause a significant reduction in dollar power. And it's going to present Donald Trump with certain problems, but ones which I am confident that he can navigate around. A foolish, pointless step, stinging, as I said, like a dead wasp. An action by an exhausted president at the end of a failed and broken presidency. Well, there it is. I've discussed this all in great detail. I'll be interested to see what others have to say. There are lots of other things going on. Now, there's been more news from the Ukrainian battlefronts over the last 24 hours. There's been more reports about further Russian advances in the Kursk pocket. I get the clear impression that the Russians are now actually fairly close to an assault on Suja. There is reports that a district, a village that really forms part of Velikaya Novosilka has just been captured by the Russians, which strongly suggests that Velikaya Novosilka itself is about to be stormed, that the operation to capture Velikaya Novosilka is indeed underway. There have been pictures of Russian soldiers raising flags in various places in Toretsk. That is often a sign that the Russians are about to announce the fall of Toretsk, and perhaps we should expect that at some point over the next 10 days or so. The Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed that one of the two villages called Shevchenko, I believe this is the one closest to Kurachovo, the one that lies on top of the lithium deposit, that village of Shevchenko has fallen under Russian control. And, well, there have been reports of other Russian advances in other places. But anyway, I will no doubt return to discussing the military situation in Ukraine in rather more detail in another program. What I will say is that there is some reason to think that all is not fully well in another important international relationship, and that is the one between the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Now, it seems that Netanyahu will not be traveling to Donald Trump's inauguration. There's been much discussion as to why that might be so. The official reason is that it is connected to the ICC's arrest warrant. Well, that may be true, but I would say this. The ICC did confirm its warrant in November, but Netanyahu had previously travelled to the United States in August. It didn't seem to me that he was particularly worried by the legal proceedings in the ICC at that time. I don't myself take this claim especially seriously. Could it be, and I simply ask the question, that Donald Trump is not reacting positively to the pressure that he's coming under to launch missile strikes on Iran? And I say that because in his press conference, the one I talked about a few days ago, when discussing Iran, I got the strong impression that Trump was not at all keen on starting another war with Iran at this particular time. Well, I don't know, and this might be a guess. It could be that, in fact, Netanyahu and Trump, there's no real strains between them at all. But in truth, I would have expected Netanyahu to want to go to the United States for the inauguration. I appreciate that it is not often the case that world leaders attend the US president's inauguration. But then Netanyahu is in a different position from other world leaders relative to the United States, just saying. So I would have thought that he would have wanted to meet with and speak to Donald Trump as soon as possible. Could it be that the true reason is because, as I said, there are tensions between them, presumably over Iran, and Netanyahu chose not to go because he couldn't be completely sure of the warmth of his welcome? Again, let me stress, it's more a question than a comment. I'm not absolutely sure. No doubt we will find out in due course. Well, this is my program for today. I think this move, I should just finish by saying that I think this move by the Biden administration is the last substantive act that they're likely to make. They took the decision a few weeks ago, rather they went forward with the decision a few weeks ago to launch the missile strikes against Russia. That didn't work out as they'd expected. They've done various other things as well. This is the last big thing that they are able to do. I think that they've exhausted their toolkit of things that they can do to make life difficult for Vladimir Putin and for Donald Trump. Trump, incidentally, I notice, has said absolutely nothing indicating that he supports this latest sanctions announcement, just saying. And he's previously made it fairly clear that he's become deeply cynical and skeptical about sanctions and thinks that the United States uses them too much. Just saying. But anyway, we will see what Donald Trump does. I think we now have a relatively smooth pathway towards the inauguration. I doubt that there's anything much more that's going to happen between now and then, though with the present administration, you can never be completely sure. Anyway, this is my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button if you like this video. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.